Good afternoon. Welcome to the Fireside chat with Luca about autonomous systems, AI, the future, robots, and so on. Luca, let's start with, could you give us a brief description of the work you're doing currently at Panasonic?
Yeah, so I run the innovation center in Cupertino. So we're kind of like the crazy guy, the Google X for Panasonic. And my background is in machine learning, and I've been doing speech recognition, natural language processing, computer vision, and all of that. But now the focus is on autonomous systems. That's really what's hot right now, and it ties into IoT, of course.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, we hear these words constantly, and we've been hearing about AI for decades. Has there been any breakthroughs lately that have made a difference and that really pushing us forward to the promises that have been made but not kept?
Well, first of all, my personal feeling is that AI is very cyclical, so we are in the bubble. So then, of course, people dump money in a lot of crazy things, including AI. That's one point. But then it's kind of like in nature, right? I think progress in AI come from three aspects. Improvements in computation, data, and algorithms, and we had all three. Data, of course, that's the topic of this conference. Computation mostly is the GPU computing, so that's NVIDIA, and
So
algorithms too.
Those are brute force methods, though, really, aren't they?
But the algorithm is deep learning, and then deep learning is just kind of like a keyword. But there have been actually some breakthrough there. There being breakthrough on three aspects. Plus, the bubble situation means that you have lots of money to actually push the technology forward.
When did those breakthroughs occur?
So the Toronto group had first, that's Jeff Hinton group, who's now at Google, had first breakthrough in 2006 at the university. 2009, they came to Mountain View, and then between 2010 and 2013, they hired everybody on the planet, and it's between Google and Facebook and a few others, but yeah.
And what have they done with all that great talent?
Well, so perception, I think, is pretty much a solved problem. There was the famous thing that everybody talks about for computer vision. Vision is a hard problem. If you look at our visual cortex, takes like 40% of our brain. And, computer vision researchers, they had this plan to solve it over 30 years, which means that, all these faculties, they could plan for funding for the next 30 years and then just be quiet and, happy. And then suddenly, deep learning came out and they solved the problem in 2.5 to 3 years. I mean, pretty much it's a solved problem, right? So it's a big deal.
Google is harnessing human energies most of the time, like in the capture stuff and so on, to solve some of these problems.
Yeah, well, so that's becoming a little bit technical, but yeah, I mean, Google has lots of things that they can harness, yeah.
You've written that you believe in a future of autonomous systems and so on. What's the future for autonomous humans in that?
Well, so before we get to that, I wanted to clarify what I mean by autonomous system. I mean action taking, right? So the idea here is that we're talking about IoT, and we get all this data, and then what do we do with the data? Usually there is a person that needs to interpret it and take an action. Now people make a big deal about the Nest thermostat. It does take an action. It changes the temperature of your home. So okay, but it's like one thing, it's temperature. So think about action taking, and once you gather all this data, you can do stuff with it, and it's done autonomously by robots, all sort of either as a software or a physical robot, and think what that means for our world, right?
Management actions?
All sorts of things, right? And that depends, how much your AI improves in the future. It's hard to say, but then the point with that is, you can actually think about the effects that has in a society. For instance, there was recently an article by The Guardian that said that up to 35 to 50% of the people could be displaced by that because their jobs could be implemented by some sort of autonomous system and robots. So the idea is you gather the data, but you're able to take an action on that, whether it is a physical or whether it's like a purely software action. This is what I want to focus on.
Okay. And so have there been any breakthroughs in decision making?
So that's a harder area, right? But it's coming. It's starting to happen, right? So for instance, yesterday I was mentioning.
You need to analyze a lot of things on the fly to be able to do that. Right?
Yes.
It's not looking up a table and saying, okay, well.
Yes, but an autonomous vehicle needs to do that, right? And we know that autonomous vehicle, will become a reality in the next 5 years. So an autonomous vehicle stops, at the intersection and needs to decide, do I move forward or not? That's kind of an important decision, right? You must down up, you kill people. So, So this will be solved, it's being solved, and then how do I apply something like this to make actions across the board. For instance, today, if you think about it, we cannot even envision a factory floor without robots, right? But in the 70s and in the 80s, there were like lots of like unions and protests and people being like, oh my God, these robots on a factory floor are displacing jobs. What's the difference between having robots in a factory floor and the kind of robots, or autonomous system I'm talking about today is that a factory floor is a purely controlled environment. So you need a much higher level of intelligence, so it's really an AI problem to take this technology outside the factory, and it's happening today.
If you take humans out of the equation, then autonomous cars don't have to try and predict what a human's going to do. You have factory floors that are completely safe because there's no humans on them.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. But then what do you do with all the other humans? What do? They play video games, or they just move to Bahamas? That's
maybe they can pretend to be robots.
That's very nice. I have not thought about that, but yeah.
Yes, I think potentially we could see the end of work. However, we don't share equally in the fruits of society. Why would we share equally in the fruits of tomorrow's technology?
Can you rephrase that?
I'm saying that today our society is skewed in the interests of special interest groups and a small minority at the top. Extrapolating that into a future where robots are running around in the service of people, well, whose service are they really in?
Right, that's great. So everybody here, if you guys watch the YouTube video from Mike Earn about DAO, Distributed Autonomous Organization, and that ties, sorry, it's becoming a little bit visionary, but it ties into, the blockchain society, and it's the idea that you can create, once you have an autonomous agent, in his talk he's talking about, for instance, a taxi company that owns itself through Bitcoin, so it can decide when it needs to purchase a new taxi, right? So nobody really owns that. It owns itself, right? And there is a technology path to get there. Now the point is, what is the policy? What is, what are governments going to do about it? I mean, if the improvement in efficiency is huge, they might actually go for it, but it's completely transformational, right? But this is more like the crypto communist view of the future of the world. But some of these things are going to happen, right?
Yeah. Yes, they will happen. Yes, they most certainly will. And I think the future of technology is easy to predict, right? But the future of how it's going to impact us and we're going to use it, that's where we get into trouble. And that's the part that interests me personally the most, because these technologies are extensions of ourselves as tools and so on. Correct. And they perform great value for us. But then what do we do with all the time we're going to have? I mean, personally, I think we'll be able to explore this curious condition of human being rather than human buying as consumerism and materialism. But coming back to artificial intelligence, we have enough problems with identifying human intelligence. How are we going to really develop artificial intelligence of a high enough quality?
Well, yeah, right. So it's kind of hard to say what intelligence is, which is, I mean, I think there are people just doing PhDs and trying to define what's the meaning of intelligence. I think they're very intelligent themselves. But the point there is, if you only focus on action taking, it's easier, right? You have a task and you want to accomplish it. We don't, I mean, it's kind of hype now. Everybody's talking about autonomous vehicles, so it's a good example. Yeah. We don't even think when we drive. So do we call that intelligence? Well, believe me, as an AI problem, it is a big deal, right? But, so the idea there is that if you start to remove those tasks that AI people still call AI, but like humans just call driving, right? But I mean, the world spend a lot of time doing those tasks, right? Then humanity will have to focus on something else. So the idea is they're going to move into more creative things, more and more, right? So we'll all become artists and innovations. I mean, I don't know, right? I mean, but this is one idea, right?
I get inspiration from the ancient Greeks, because they weren't running around saying, oh my God, the slaves have taken our jobs. What are we going to do? They said, right, let's invent philosophy, the sciences, theater, drama, democracy, let's do that. Brilliant, we're still living off of the work of maybe 100,000 people who didn't have a job, right? What if we had 7 billion ancient Greeks running around? There'd be a lot of drama, but what else?
Yeah, I mean, that's the positive view of the future. The negative view is that people will just get really upset and start rioting. It also becomes a policy question.
How
right?
does this fit in with Panasonic? Panasonic is a huge global
Yeah,
corporation.
well, actually, I'm still trying to figure it out myself. I'm sorry, but no. Okay, so in many areas, right? So sorry, I mean, I don't want to sound too out of place in this panel, but the idea. Let me take a step back. The idea of IoT, which we heard is really not the new, people used to call it ubiquitous computing and all that, is that you have all this data, right? But if you look at the McKinsey report, only 1% of the data out of an oil rig, it's a pretty clear application there, gets used. So big
Because
data
maybe
really
that's
means,
the only data you need. don't need all of it.
possibly, or maybe because nobody really knows what to do with the data, right? So the idea of like IoT that transform into big data, and then what do you do with all this big data? People are like, okay, we're gonna do big intelligence, right, or big head, how I call it. But
You need big meaning. Is
yeah,
what
yeah,
they're
yeah. So
talking about.
So, and this is the point, right? This is an AI problem. Then once you have the intelligence, the next step is action taking. So, I don't know about Panasonic, but like, manufacturing actually is always by McKinsey is identified as being a big area of productivity improvement by big data and IoT, right? That's one thing. And if you look, there was an announcement last week. Toyota made a $1 billion investment here in Silicon Valley, partnered with Stanford University. And of course, autonomous drive is one application they do because they realize they need to catch up with Google. It's not cool that a web company is building cars now, but the next step is really using this technology into the factory to improve the way you're manufacturing things.
Those are going to be incremental things because big data is going to give you some analysis and show up some inefficiencies. But those inefficiencies aren't going to be, I'm going to raise your revenues 100%, 50%. The most you're going to get is maybe 5, 10%. And once you've figured out that low-hanging fruit, the rest of it is going to be fairly incremental. So the promise of big data and so on and these efficiencies, I think is being misjudged, seriously.
Right, and that's why I add action taking to the mix. So I have the numbers for you. I did my research. So McKinsey again said that the IoT in the automotive industry can provide a $210 to $500 billion opportunity. It's big, right? But the Center of Automotive Research at Stanford said that once you add autonomy into it, so if you're considering the world being completely moved around by autonomous vehicle, now that's a $1.3 billion. Actually, that's not even the world. That's the U.S. opportunity. So that's between 2 to 3 times.
For the vendors.
It's the opportunity for everything, right? Because like we said, you might not even need parking lots anymore. Isn't that cool to make, I mean, look how much it costs to rent
because,
like a
data has this, the more we know about the data, there's some kind of El Dorado in this data, right? But look at Facebook. Facebook probably has more data about each of us and so on than anybody in the world. And you know how much money it makes on that information, all that valuable information? It makes less than a quarter in profits per user per month. Now, that doesn't sound really valuable, that data, to me. I mean, obviously, they're not using it to its fullest extent, but still, it's easy for McKinsey and so on to just take a ruler and provide those figures. What's really going to happen is, how are we going to react to it? What services is it going to enable? The autonomous, I mean, I joke that millennials like self-driving cars because it reminds them of their mum coming and picking them up and dropping them off. And I know millennials in the office tell me they will never buy a car. They're not interested in learning how to drive one even. And saying, well, you're missing out on a lot of pleasure. Yes, some of our driving is autonomous, but when you're in a car that performs well, it's a joy. And they're never going to experience that.
But we are old-timers, right? I love my self-driving, but the thing is, once you start to consider like autonomous agent and action taking,
how will it affect your life?
Well, how would it affect my life? Well, first of all, I wouldn't be stuck in traffic. That's already a good start, right?
You could be telecommuting from home right now.
Yeah, but people have been talking about like this telecommuting. Panasonic was one of the biggest company to push telepresence and all of that. And yet, if you take like the San Francisco to Kansai flight, it's full of Panasonic people every single day.
Yeah.
So I'm scratching my head, right? At the end of the day, to be face-to-face with people like here, you know, it's so much better. There is something still about the human connection that, you know, telecommuting doesn't allow. So that's one point, right? And then the second point is, this is a little unfortunate, but, you know, agent compared to humans, they scale better, right? So, for instance, they don't care too much about welfare yet. They don't strike. And they tend to get better and cheaper with time, which is kind of like the opposite of what humans are. And so if you tie this into a capitalistic society, well, suddenly you have a problem. The agent wins and the human loses, or becomes a philosopher.
But I think if any of these agents truly become sentient and self-aware, I think the first thing they'll do, they'll look around and they'll commit suicide. And that will be a true sign of intelligence. But it will die. It will die in that instance of self-consciousness.